Hi guys, so this should be the second video that you've watched for notes this week. So just to kind of recap what you should have learned from last video and kind of some things you need to make sure you had in your notes was why Darwin published his book, the name of his book, what natural selection is and maybe an example, what artificial selection is and an example of that, what the struggle for existence means, what fitness is, what an adaptation is and maybe an example, and then how natural selection is related to a species fitness. Okay? So just some things that you should make sure you have in your kind of like the key points of the last video to kind of go back, review, and make sure those are the things that you did get in your notes, okay? So we're going to go ahead and move on with today. And today we're going to talk about some evidence that we have that supports the theory of evolution. One of the things that Darwin suggested in his book was that natural selection produces organisms that can have different structures. So you can have wings, you can have flippers, you can have arms. They'll have different niches. And if you remember from ecology, a niche is an organism's job or role in its ecosystem. And it will create organisms that live in different habitats as well, whether they are aquatic or freshwater, marine, soil, live in mountain ranges or in cold climates or tropical rainforests, anything like that. So it just creates this wide range of different species that are built differently, have different roles, and live in different places. And each of these species have descended from a common ancestor, but as they've descended, they've become modified. They've gotten a little bit different. So again, if we have like one ancestral bird throughout history and through this evolution, this change over time, these different species have come about, but because they're descendants of that common ancestor, that they've also changed over time. Okay? So Darwin called this descent with modification. You're descendants of a common ancestor, but you're modified. You have some differences. You have new adaptations possibly. So we're going to look at the some key evidence of evolution. There's a couple of different ones, but these are kind of just like some big three that we're going to look at for the most part, and they're kind of like big ideas. And I'll give you some examples of them as well. And then later this week, I've asked you to do like a modified web quest. It's more of I want you to explore a couple of different websites and come up with your own example, given the information that you look at. So what we're going to talk about today is some evidence that we have supporting the theory of evolution. And one of the big key evidence that we have is the fossil record. We're going to look at something called homologous structures. And we're going to look at similarities in early development, and that's called embryology. It's the study of embryos. So the fossil record basically is a history of the life on planet Earth. The further down in the earth, towards the center of the earth that you find a fossil, the older it is. So the oldest fossils naturally are buried deepest in the earth because over time, new soil is created and layered on top of it. So if you want to find the oldest living organisms, you would go as deep down in the earth as you possibly could. So what you would do then is say you found a fossil that's a mile deep in the ground and a fossil that's only a half mile deep in the ground. You could compare those two things, see if there's enough similarities to say that they're related, or compare them to other fossils that you found, but you would also know that the one deepest in the earth is also the oldest. And this is how we're able to look at some changes over time, because we've found fossils that might resemble something that we're familiar with, and we say, well, maybe they're related. But I'm going to, look at other fossils and see what differences and similarities they have. So in case you're not sure what a fossil looks like, There you go. Sometimes we find full skeletons, and sometimes we just find simple like imprints of fossils too. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're just like holding on to the whole bone. Okay, so this picture might look a little funky, but let me see. Let me grab a color here so you can see what's going on. So this is the really old end of the time frame, and this would be like the younger side. I'm writing with my mouse, so don't just be thankful that we can at least kind of make out like what I'm writing. Hey, not too bad. Okay, so we're moving this direction. Ooh, the arrow leaves something to be desired here. It's not that great, is it? Okay, so what we are seeing here is that we have this this critter here. I don't know what's going to happen if I we'll see. We'll just highlight him. There we go. So if I found that fossil really deep in the earth, I can use something called carbon dating to figure out approximately how old he is, and that has to do with measuring how much like radioactive isotopes and things that are left. But we're able to do some testing to find out how old fossils are. Okay, so let's say I found that guy first. Okay, and then through my digging, I find, you know, this guy here in blue. I'll be like, well, maybe he's related to this guy because, you know, he's got a tail, he's got 4 legs, he's kind of got a longer head. Okay. But then I find this guy here in green. I'm like, oh, wait, okay, so he definitely looks more like this yellow one than this blue one. Okay, cool. And I know that this blue one is younger because you see how it's off to the right a little bit. I know this is younger because he wasn't as deep in the earth. So I know that this one the blue one came after this one in the yellow. So you've got to think of using the fossil record kind of like putting together a puzzle 5 pieces at a time. That at first you might only be given 5 pieces of the puzzle and you kind of lay it out as best you can. You get 5 more pieces and you can add on to, rearrange, and then slowly it starts to come together. Well, what happens is there's huge gaps in time between these fossils here, okay? But every so often we find a new set of fossils where we're able to like add a critter between these two. And those are called intermediate fossils, that we find a new skeleton that we can put in between these, and it kind of starts filling in the blanks of evolution of how these animals came to exist in their different forms. So we're able to fill in the blanks, kind of like filling in the blanks of a puzzle piece when you're given new additional puzzle pieces. Okay, so the fossil record is how we can kind of determine who's older, which came first, which ones evolved first, things like that. Okay, so homologous structures, I've taught you guys before about breaking down words. The word homo, or the prefix homo, we have learned means same. Let me see if I can, whoop, 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 whoop. Oh, here I go trying to write with the mouse again. Means same, if you guys remember talking about homozygous. Okay. And homologous structures are body parts that come from the same cells, the layers of cells, when an embryo is forming. Okay, so when an embryo forms, there's typically 3 layers of a cell. There is the inside layer called ectoderm. Then you have another layer out called the mesoderm, meaning the middle. And then the very outside layer, you have ectoderm. So endo, meso, ecto, moving outwards. And the outside layer becomes like your skin and your nerves and your hair and feathers and things like that. Well, what happens in order to like build an animal is those layers start folding and creating tissues, which is just layers upon layers of cells. So in order to form an arm, it has this embryo will have a section of all these layers that will form an arm. But in birds, same layers, but it forms a wing. So a wing and an arm are homologous structures because they form from the same embryonic tissues during their own development. That's not meaning that a human could develop a wing. It's just meaning that the same layer of tissues in an embryo that forms the arm in a human would also be the same tissues that of an embryo that form a wing in a bird. And you see this when you look more at, I don't really like that picture nearly as much as this one because this is a little easier to look at. Let's look at the bones, okay? So here, this is our upper arm, like up here. This is called your humerus. That's the one that you smack on the corner like your elbow, and they call it your funny bone because it's humerus. Haha. No, I know quarantine has not been well to me. If you look at that humerus, this whitish colored bone up here, it is in the similar location as the one in the dog leg, in the flipper, and in the bat wing. Now, they are slightly modified in shape and in size, but their location is very much the same. And that is the case for these other bones. You've got this red and whitish bone here. That's your radius and your ulna in your forearm here. Notice that those are also present in the dog or wolf leg. They are in the flipper, and they're also in the bat wing. But again, their location is the same, but their size and shape is slightly modified. And that has to do with how those limbs are being used. The flipper is being used for swimming, the bat's for flying, the human is mostly, it's not a support structure, we just use those to pick things up, whereas the dog is a four-legged critter, so that does support its entire body, so it would make sense that those two bones are slightly thicker than the ones in the humans. Whereas the bat wing, they fly, they want to be light, they're very, very thin. And in the dolphin, they're very thick, but they're not very long. So to give more power when they are swimming through the water. But you also see in the yellow, those are like in our wrist, those are the carpals. Those are also present in all of those other organisms as well. That's because embryos develop in the same order, whether it's a human embryo or a dog embryo. We all go through the same order of development, like what, the heart and the spinal cord go first, and then the different layers will start to differentiate, which means to become different, the different pieces and parts to the organism. And because they go in that same order, they are using the same pieces of tissue to create those different body structures, that there's some similarity there. You can't ignore how similar vertebrates, anything with a backbone, develop, because it's so very similar to throughout all of the different vertebrates. So not all homologous structures, though, have a purpose. For example, look here. Back here, this is always so much fun. See this little structure? Oh, crap. I picked it. There we go. Let's change that. No, not going to change it. There's this structure back here. Can I erase? Hold on. I totally messed that up, guys. Sorry. There we go. No, there we go. All right, see the structure in yellow here? There we go. Any idea what that is? Like, because we got a whale here. There's a big jaws. Okay. This is actually the pelvic bone, the hip bones. What's connected to your hip bones? Your thigh bones, like your femurs, right? Why would a whale have hip bones when they don't have rear legs, hind legs? Perhaps they had those legs at once. At some point, maybe whales had hind limbs where they needed to have a hip bone, a pelvis, but they don't anymore. So because they don't have the hind legs anymore, they don't need the pelvis anymore, because it's not useful to the body, it just gets reduced in size and gets smaller and smaller and smaller, or eventually can just disappear altogether. This is called a vestigial organ or a vestigial structure. It is when organisms that have some relationship, so like us and the whale are related because we're both vertebrates, we're both mammals. I have a pelvis, it does too. It doesn't use it, so it's really, really small. Another example of a vestigial organ would be your appendix. What the heck does that thing do? Doesn't really have a purpose other than it gets irritated sometimes and likes to explode and make people sick. This is your appendix down here. This tiny, tiny little sliver back through here. Just looks like a worm. No real purpose, or it doesn't serve a purpose nowadays. It might have served a purpose tens of thousands of millions of years ago, but when humans, first came into existence or whatever, but it doesn't now. So it's very much reduced in size. Another vestigial organ you'd be more familiar with is what we call our tailbone. That last little bone in our butt area. Why would we call it a tailbone for a reason, because it's thought that perhaps humans once had tails. We also know that during embryonic development, we do have a tail, and then it's what they call resorbed. Those vertebrae are pulled back into the trunk of the body rather than left outside. But if you've ever heard of there possibly being a baby born with a tail, and it's just because that little piece of bone it didn't get fully resorbed back in. This will make a little more sense when we look at the next slide. Okay, so the last evidence of evolution that we have is we're going to look at embryos. So on the left here, I have a chicken embryo. And when I was in high school, because you guys know I lived in the middle of nowhere, we incubated chicken eggs. So we had fertilized eggs that we kept in an incubator so to keep them warm so they can develop. And every few days we would gently crack open the top of an egg, take a paper circle with the center cut out of it, put it over top of the embryo, and pull the embryo out of the egg. Well, yes, this would kill the chicken egg or the chicken embryo, but the reason we looked at it is because under a microscope, you could see its heartbeat, and you could see exactly what is in this picture, all of these different body parts. On the right, we have a human embryo, a very, very young human embryo. I would say not quite old enough to have a heartbeat yet, maybe. So it's probably only, right at that 6, 7, maybe 8 week mark. But what I want you to see is the similarities here, okay? Let me see, I'm gonna change my pen over so you can actually see what's going on. Okay, so here, if you see this ladder kind of thing going on here, this is the spinal cord, and then you see the vertebrae developing through here. And you could also see that in the human. You see the spinal cord and we see the vertebrae. We see this structure here that is a bud to to develop into a wing. We also have a bud right here that is going to become an arm. This is the head region on the human. Same here. You can kind of see how there's 3 pieces to the head. Same in the humans. That's because we have 3 main parts to our brain: forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. And then we also start out with having these pharyngeal pouches, which is where you might have heard somebody say something like we had gills at one point while we're developing. It's because we all start out with these pharyngeal pouches which is kind of like this area of our bodies, where all of those things start to fold in and gives us our vocal cords and our larynx, that's your voice box, but gives us this complex throat sort of development. And then there are no lungs or gills yet, because all of this nutrition and things, there's no need for it yet, but they get all their nutrition through what it is attached to right here. And that is a yolk sac. So whenever you hear somebody talk about an egg, you think like a chicken egg, you've got the white part and you have a yolk. Well, same with humans. In our egg, we have a yolk, and while the embryo is developing, it gets all its nutrition from the yolk. And then in that time, that's when the embryo is building an umbilical cord to attach to the placenta to start getting food and oxygen and blood flow and things from mom. And that's when the yolk has, run out at that point. Same idea here with the chicken. But if I would have kept these names covered up, could you have told me that these were 2 different animals? I mean, they look different because this one's red and that one's white, but could you have visually discerned that that one's the chicken and that one's the human? More than likely not. That's because most embryos that belong to organisms with a backbone or vertebrates look just like this as an embryo. And that's because sperm meets egg, and then there is like a definite set of steps of development. Like this happens first, then this, then this. All the vertebrates kind of go in the same order. And that is why we are able to develop similar body structures from the same layers of tissue, because we develop in the same order. So just to kind of wrap up what that means is groups of embryonic cells develop in the same order and give us similar patterns to produce tissues and organs that are similar through all vertebrates, anything with a backbone. Inverts, I teach that class too. Inverts are a little bit different because we're a little bit weird, because not all of them have the same layers and things like that. But yeah, so the big 3 today with that evidence that we're talking about is the fossil record, homologous structures, and similarities in embryology with how our embryos develop. So what you guys kind of needed to take away from a little bit last lesson and then this one is who kind of motivated Darwin to publish his book. What are some differences among individuals of a single species referred to as? Like what is the difference between different species called? Changes that increase a species' fitness in its environment over time are caused by what? An inherited characteristic that increases an organism's chance of survival is called what? And what evidence was used by Darwin to support the idea of evolution? There's a couple that we talked about today. So I would go back, and these questions here and then the questions at the beginning of this video, I would just make sure that are in your notes with examples, and that'll kind of help guide you down the right path of making sure that you kind of got everything out of what we've gone through the past week and a half or so. Okay? All right, guys, I will see you next time.